Hello and welcome to our Health and Science T-level recording on effective differentiation in the Health and Science Technical Qualification. I'd just first like to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. So all information provided is correct as of recording of April 2023 and may not reflect future changes to guidance documents. So please always review the most up-to-date guidance. So my name is Tracy and I am one of the provider development officers with NCFE. Along with Marina, who will introduce herself in a bit more detail shortly. Our role is to support you in CPD to really focus on teaching and learning strategies to support your student outcomes. So for me, I come from FE and teaching health and social care. So I've really brought that knowledge and looked at how we can adapt it, expand on it, and make it relevant to the T-level health and science qualifications. Pass you over to Marina, who will give you a bit more information on her.
Hello, yes, I'm Marina. So alongside Tracy, I'm a provider development officer. My background is much more from the science side. So I have a PhD in neuroscience with a medical research focus, and I've been a science and maths tutor for many, many years. So I kind of love to bring that practical science and that way to engage those sort of tough to teach topics into the classroom. I'm going to now pass back to Tracy to go over the aims and objectives of this session.
Thank you, Marina. So our aim of today's session is to really explore how in T-levels we can ensure that sort of differentiated teaching and learning to ensure that students are meeting their maximum potential. So by the end of today's recording, you'll be able to identify key areas in the content which will allow for that differentiated learning. We'll be able to explore key teaching strategies in relation to differentiated learning in occupational specialism. We'll look at some best practice and on how students can demonstrate their learning through formative assessment. And finally, explore how to create a learning environment that is stimulative and allows for that most supportive, inclusive learning for your students. So to begin with, we're going to explore differentiation in T-levels. So before we go any further, we're going to briefly recap what we mean by differentiation. So firstly, it relates to working with groups of students, even in small groups. The needs of the students will be very different. So we're going to focus the content of today's session on working with both cohorts and adapting session in relation to individual student differences. With this in mind, it is therefore also about tutors adapting their delivery and support practice in relation to their student needs. Having a range of activities is always a good practice and links to preferred learning styles and allowing for the students to have the time and structure to learn effectively as individuals. The biggest impact on differentiation was when the teacher considers their students' needs, which we've already started to think about in relation to T-levels. So considering student skills, knowledge and levels of progress and planning to meet their developmental needs is very important, but so are ad hoc or responsive activities. So during a session, when formative assessment gives the tutor an idea of how well the students are progressing, they can adapt their practice in real time to be responsive to this. And how to record this? Well, planning a range of support and extension activities for specific students is one way to do this, but just as important are informal annotations on lesson plans, schemes of work, and showing how learning is being adapted and differentiated in direct relation to the student's progress and learning needs. And some tutors may sometimes overlook or take for granted the English, maths and digital skills needed to complete activities. GCSE grades don't always guarantee skills and knowledge, and the students can have areas of strengths or gaps in their knowledge or lower level confidence in some of these areas. It is worth considering them when planning differentiated learning. So let's have a closer look at the health and science T-levels and specifically what factors might impact your practice. Firstly, we have the student levels of motivation and engagement. In mine and Marina's conversations with delivery staff, it's apparent that these differ. Whilst the majority of students have extremely high levels, some are lower, and both of these will be a challenge, and teachers will need to use a range of strategies to successfully deal with them. Also, the individual's personal experiences and confidence levels will need to be taken into consideration. The student's IT skills and access to resources, students' English and math skills and attitude, so linking to GCSE grades from last year, and of course the students' attitudes towards how important these are to their T-level success, which also brings us to that academic literacies and the challenges of the level 3 work brings. In relation to individual levels of progress, thinking about how aware the students are of their progress, how motivated they are to push themselves, and what their individual hooks are. In regards to this, I mean the type of approach teachers to take to motivate and encourage them to improve. Students' ability to cope and their levels of resilience. This is really important post-COVID. Tutors may need to consider which students would need further reassurance and or support to keep going. In relation to the work ethic and work experience, sometimes it's really important to sort of take this into consideration in relation to the industry placement. Tutors need to consider how strong the students' abilities and competencies are in relation to being work ready and adapt their input to highlight areas of the core content which some students need more or less input on. The differences in the circumstances of students in your cohort, for example, relationships between the students groups and who works best with whom. These also can rapidly change with teenagers, so be mindful of these and highlight and facilitate, I beg your pardon, facilitate activities which develop students' co-working abilities and managing relationships, which may need to be differentiated. The students' problem-solving skills and abilities will also impact on your planning for differentiation. It might be the problem-solving skills of some students need to be developed via a different teaching and learning approach. The students' awareness of their areas of strengths and weaknesses will impact on your practice. Think about the students who need to be more reflective and would benefit from improving their awareness of the levels of progress and priorities of development. You also have your students' preferred learning styles, and although we know this is an area which is sometimes under contest, it is something that we should be aware of, both ourselves and yourselves as practitioners, and looking at learning and also applying learning theory to practice in the industry context. The students' prior learning experience will also have an impact on their ability to engage with learning experience we provide for them. They're human, and if they had a negative experience in the past, they'll bring them to our learning context. And also another factor is any LDD or SEN requirements. This is probably easier generally due to formal support plans and professional input and guidance, but it is something that will align and impact any planning and delivery that you're undertaking. And student finances, there'll be a range of different backgrounds and personal circumstances. And this is very relevant at the moment due to sort of economic pressures that are impacting families across the country. And finally, even the time of year or day can impact. So for teenagers, how they manage at different times impacts on their ability to focus on learning. And this is something really important to consider. So for example, do you have a student that does better in the morning? Or do you have students that does better in the afternoon? And research has also showing that generally teenagers do perform better on the afternoon. So does that impact what teaching strategy content that you're going to then deliver? And even the time of year. So we know that winter can have an impact more so on mental health and well-being of both students and ourselves. So it's also a really important factor to look at when planning. So I'm now going to pass you to Marina, who's going to explore these in more detail, specifically in relation to the T-level content.
Thanks, Tracy. So what I'm going to do now is look more closely at the T-level components and make some suggestions for approaches and activities that you could consider for differentiated learning. So we start with the academic level and expectations. So as Tracy mentioned on the previous slide, the T-level can be quite a big step up from some students from GCSE. So tutors may need to consider which students need support to carry out like research independently, to be able to read exam questions correctly, to write appropriate academic language. etc. It might also be that there's a need to have specific teaching and learning activities relating to identifying what academic and reading and writing is. So how to write for different audiences from different perspectives, let's say first and third person, exploring tone and type of language used in academic studies. Also looking at the assessment, so we have the exams of the ESP as our core assessments, and for many students and tutors, the move to these different forms of assessment might be something which needs to be factored into differentiated learning activities. So revising, preparing for exams, being able to apply theory that they've gained, things like this might need to be considered. So considering your students, who might need help to create a revision timetable? Which students might need writing frames to get them started responding to an extended response exam question? How could you pair your students or group them to allow for peer learning or support? Questions like this and other things will also be helpful to consider which students may have some skills already, and then also allowing them to support your other students, but also allowing them extension activities so they can further develop their learning. And the industry placement is a big area for differentiated learning. And it's important that we want to prepare our students for their placement. So we want to give them the confidence levels and that to be able to gain that experience. However, from our starting base, we'll find that this level of confidence varies across the cohort. There's nothing new, but it is a factor in how a student may settle and apply themselves to their work placement. So if we can further improve that confidence and further get them those work ready skills and give them a more rewarding placement experience. Also looking at the wider skills and competencies. So for English and maths, we need to consider the skills needed to be successful on the T level, but also how the students will be expected to utilise these skills in the industry. So when they progress beyond the T level. As they're vital to the success of every student and employee, promotion of the development of English and maths is deemed best practice. Some students may need more support than others. So for example, you could have starter or re-energizing activities planned in for all students. But also it can be a good opportunity to get support from your subject specialist colleagues to allow you to be the most effective. So bringing in your English department, your maths department to create the kind of more holistic approach to delivering the content. For digital skills, you may need to consider the differences in the students' skills and knowledge due to their prior experience. So some students might be more confident and knowledgeable than others because they might have digital technology at home or they might use it frequently for work, whereas other students may have access to very little or no technology. So if you take an example of, let's say, creating a professional presentation, would your students know the best software to use for this task? Could they navigate the ribbon, select the correct formatting tools? Could they insert and edit images? So having digital activities planned in your delivery is good practice to support your students, regardless of the background they have come from. Now looking at communication and other core skills, opportunities to apply communication and the wider core skills, these can either be embedded, explicitly taught, or a combination of both. Students should be encouraged to use active listening to speak and communicate effectively in all activities and experiences. This is a thing that's kind of encouraged, as communication is a key part of not only T-level, not only placement, not only even going to industry, but whatever further steps that your students will take. Employability and progression. It might be useful for some students to be supported to reflect on their skills and explore those sometimes known as softer skills and competencies that they may need to develop or improve to be successful in industry. We've got to be aware that the awareness of these types of skills that are needed in industry might not be there in the 16 to 17-year-olds we're working with. Additionally, some students might require more input and guidance than others in relation to their most appropriate progression route. It's important that we support them and have these conversations. And this leads on to reflection and awareness of development needs. So although reflective practice is in the core skills and we deliver it as part of the assessments, it's valuable in industry and it's something that's probably going to be an important factor to consider when planning differentiated activities. So you can consider student experience or lack of experience due to COVID, which will have impacted various stages of their prior learning. So activities and experiences when preparing for placement can be supported through practice and simulation in the classroom. So now I want to give you some questions for you to consider. What are your students' needs? How are they being recorded, met, and reviewed on a regular basis? How aware are your students of their needs and how they're being met? As well as meeting needs, are they being supported? Are they being stretched effectively? Now, considering the activities, what are you using? How effective are they? Are you reflecting and reviewing this? And finally, do you make assumptions about your students? Does this impact your delivery? Some food for thought, which can help when we're tackling this topic and when we're doing our planning. I'm now going to pass back to Tracy to go over differentiated learning.
Thank you, Marina. So we're going to look at a strategy that can be used for both differentiated learning and also differentiated formative assessment. So learning stations is becoming quite a new researched area in regards to differentiated instruction. This allows students, it's been found that learning stations allow tutors to empower and engage students because it allows for an accommodation of different learning styles. It's also really helpful tactic to employ differentiated instruction strategies or learning stations, and it's a really good way to supply your class with multiple ways to learn and understand concepts. It's very flexible. It allows for flexible grouping or individual learning. It allows for differentiated instruction as a whole, and as learning stations are fluid and they can span multiple levels. It gives both students and tutors insight as to how a particular individual learns best. And these students offer the opportunity for students to learn independently whilst also keeping them really engaged. So it's really important in a learning station to sort of provide different types of sort of content by setting up learning stations. So set up your learning stations that are maybe so for example, you're delivering content on legislation. So what you're going to do is you're then going to create a different learning station for students to then consolidate that knowledge. And each of it is a really a unique method of teaching a skill or concept related to that lesson. So you may get at one station, the students to create a presentation, at different station, reading an article and evaluating that article. At a third station, completing a little practical sim session. At a fourth session, listening to you present. So that's your role in the station, is you're the presenting. So you're giving the verbal, the same content verbally. And then a final station just to allow for that reflecting of their understanding of that content. So each of those stations allow for the students to understand the same content area in a different way. And we can turn these learning stations into formative assessment stations. So really adapting that. It's a unique method that allows with that differentiated format of occupational synoptic assessment. So if you think about the occupational synoptic assignments, they are quite differentiated because you have that mix of practical, verbal discussions, written discussions. So therefore, your occupational synoptic is allowing for that differentiation. So your formative assessment stations can sort of align with that synoptic way of assessing. So each station again would be kind of unique. So it allows for that differentiated assessment of learning. So they could create a healthcare plan or risk assessment on one. Case studies with theme question or written clinical stimuli on the second. Again, a practical session on the third that aligns with those knowledge and skills and the performance outcomes. It's professional discussion with the tutor on the fourth, and then a peer marking and reflection to finish. And each of those stations allowed for to allow for that formative assessment where it's not all coming from the teacher because you're doing a role as a professional tutor. You can have sort of grading descriptors, RAG status, criteria for the students then to then reflect on how they did against those criteria, and they can sort of self-assess, and that then gives you an opportunity at the end maybe to do a final comment and reflection for each individual student's progress. So a really important factor, so as well as having those differentiated learning and that differentiated formative assessment, there's also taking into account the learning environment. So the teacher must appreciate that each student is an individual. Teachers in a healthy classroom work continually to understand who their students really are and what makes them unique. At the same time, they let the students know who they are as people too. The, the tutor needs to also remember to teach the whole student. So students have intellect, emotion, and changing physical needs that we mentioned earlier, like being a teenager in winter and hormonal changes and emotional changes. So that goes beyond math and reading, and addressing things like self-esteem or an issue that a student brings from home can be the most powerful lesson of that day. It is also important that you continue to develop expertise. So, genuine expertise in the subject that you're teaching is more about applying skills and insights than mastering facts. So, developing expertise means not just teaching science, but thinking with the curiosity of a scientist. The tutor strives for joyful learning. Both words in joyful learning are key. Teachers of healthy learning environments explore and understand subject matter in order to ensure the essential elements are at the core of students' experiences. The tutor should share the teaching with the students. So invite students to be part of the teaching is important. And one of the simplest ways to have students teach each other the area in which they excel. And finally, using that really positive energy. So in the healthy sort of learning environment, there is a consistent sense of urgency about what is being learned. It's not a sense of hurriedness, but the understanding that time and discussions are valuable. There is also a clear expectation of respect and kindness, and laughter can be heard from making unexpected or spontaneous connections. So this is sort of an overview of the differentiated learning environment, and I'm sure you have many different factors that you take into account to give that best environment for your students.
So important for you to be aware of the support that's available. So we have the T-Level Provider Hub, which is our dedicated space for you to access our upcoming live events. So you can access webinars such as this, workshops on topics like this, interactively meet other providers, all that info, as well as understanding, communicating and engaging with parents. We've got some resources on there, as well as a backlog of our communications and our updates. You can view all this on the T-Level Provider Hub. You also have support from a dedicated account executive who will be meeting regularly with either like your senior managers or sometimes with delivery staff directly, addressing kind of queries. And now with regards to focusing on teaching and learning, that's where Tracy and I come in. So your centre during the first 2 years of delivery is entitled to 3 curriculum consultations. So what these are Teams calls for an hour, one-to-one, or meeting your whole delivery team with your dedicated provider development officer, being either Tracy or myself. And we will focus on supporting you in teaching and learning. So how can I bring these difficult topics to life? How can I support my SEND students in this topic? Things such as that. How can I prepare my students in these areas they're not confident in? all this is available. So if you're interested in booking a consultation, please either speak to your account executive or email Tracy or myself. And then if you have any queries, we have the dedicated T-level support email address, which you can see on the screen. Additionally, there's CPD from the provider development team. As mentioned, there is CPD that occurs live, and everything that occurs live is also recorded, and you will have access on our lovely dedicated YouTube channel. Just going to go over the aims and objectives of the session. So our overall aim was to explore how T-levels allow for differentiation to ensure all students' needs are met and their potential is maximised. I hope you can see from those objectives there, you feel confident in those areas. If this is an area that you personally for your CPD would like to develop further, please consider booking onto a curriculum consultation with Tracy or myself. Or if you think that this would be a beneficial CPD topic for others, opportunity for networking, please let us know by dropping us an email saying, I think this would be an awesome CPD suggestion. Okay, so from Tracy and myself, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you found the session useful.
Thank you.